Okay, we'll call to order the January 12th, 2026 meeting of the Milton Budget Coordinating Committee. So our main item on the agenda for today is for Nick to walk us through some of the model that we've been discussing. We had a big meeting with the Select Board Finance Committee and the School Committee Finance Committee earlier last week. And we wanted to share the details of the model that was discussed there with this team.
Okay. I will just run through probably more abridged version of what I sent to the school committee finance subcommittee on Wednesday. This committee has obviously heard iterations and versions of kind of where things stand. This is focused specifically on 27 rather than some of the more outlying years. So I'll just run through it, like I said, pretty quickly, but if there are any questions, happy to take those or any discussion.
Maggie may not have seen it. I don't know if you've seen it. So I do all 8 slides.
Okay. All right, so this is a summary level of, again, just focusing on fiscal 27 specifically, the revenue outlook. We've obviously spent a lot of time talking about the various revenue categories and our forecast for those, where we have put our kind of placeholder revenue estimate. Our working final revenue estimate is what you see in front of you. Property taxes includes that up to the max under Prop 2.5 and $1 million in new growth. Local receipts is slightly higher than we've been discussing here. We revisited that number in the last few weeks and have pushed that closer to 2% increase over the prior year in terms of a budget forecast. We will do a final run through of local receipts at the end, towards the end of this month when the motor vehicle excise commitment is wrapped up, which should be in a couple of weeks. That'll give us a clear indication of what we expect for fiscal 26. And just if we feel like a further tweak on 27 is helpful, we will do so. State aid, we have not touched from the original forecast, only because it's out of our hands and the governor releases her budget in a couple of weeks. Typically those local aid, Chapter 70 and local aid numbers come out around the time of the Mass Municipal Association annual conference, which is the 23rd. So we expect those numbers in a couple of weeks and would hope that it would result in an upward revision on state aid. On local receipts, I just to clarify, I would expect, if any, revisions to be upwards rather than reductions. So on the revenue side, any tweaks we would expect for an upward revision at this point. So that gives us a bottom line. But the last thing that I have done in terms of what I would recommend is I've suggested that we incorporate some money from the operating budget stabilization fund. I've put in $700,000 as a withdrawal from the operating budget stabilization fund. That tracks with the amount that is recurring on an annual basis. It does not get into any of the amounts that would be non-recurring. At the end of the day, that gives us about $5 million in new revenue for fiscal 27. It's about a 3.4% increase over the prior year. I have shown below the line some of the one-time infusions of money into last year's budget. We haven't accounted for any of those in this year's budget, so that kind of distorts the numbers a little bit. But the first subtotal there of 159.16 is what we're using as our working revenue estimate going forward.
Can I ask about the free cash line?
Yes.
Don't we know we have $4.5 million in free cash?
We know we have it, and we haven't planned on any appropriations into the budget as of yet.
Okay, thank you.
So that's why it's zero. If we put $1 million into capital, $1 million would go into that number, and $1 million would be added to expenses. But for now, it's a zero because it's not rolling anything in. The special purpose debt stabilization fund is tied to the fire station project. So that's more of a mathematical equation if we need funding from that fund. At this point, we don't expect to for fiscal 27. But it'll be, again, it would net out. That's just the property taxes in greater detail. Again, $3.8 million is our new property tax revenue in fiscal 27. This really hasn't moved and all along. The new growth figure is what is a little bit more something that we forecast. It's next year's new growth is based on everything that's happening now. So as we move through the year, if we feel like we're closer to last year than this year, we might be able to revise that upwards. I wouldn't expect a downwards revision there either. We've talked about new growth a lot, so I had just shared the new growth history, and as you can tell, the last few years have been well over the $1 million, really closer to 1.2 million in excess. We would expect that this, from a large project perspective, would start to decline after like fiscal 28, as all the projects that are under construction would be wrapped and fully incorporated into new growth around that point. We haven't talked about it much. There is, the chance that this growth would result in additional costs because a large of this is largely driven by multifamily housing. But on the revenue side, it's been solid. Again, we've talked about this a lot with the group. This is the local receipts in greater detail. As we've discussed in terms of one-time versus recurring, we've tweaked these slightly and we'll continue to review on motor vehicle excise. Again, where we see outlier numbers in fiscal 25, we do attribute largely to one-time monies that we wouldn't necessarily count on forever in terms of additional collections on motor vehicle, penalties and interests, both due to enhancements on the collection front, building permits. We're permitting large multifamily housing, which all of them have been permitted to now, except for 648, 652 Canal, which remains in appeal between both the Conservation Commission and the butters. And then lastly, interest income, which we spent some time discussing. While we feel comfortable increasing that forecast, not anywhere on par with what we would have seen in terms of actual revenue, just because that is such a variable year to year. On the expense side, this shows a summary of expenditures forecasted as of last week. School department at a 5.2% year over year. That's about $3.8 million, which we just talked about was the total amount of property tax revenue that is new in fiscal 27. Town departments are closer to 365. The rest of these are what we call shared expenses. Blue Hills Regional is a placeholder number, as we don't typically get that final budget until later in the year. Health insurance, we forecast health insurance at a 10% premium increase. Debt service is a pretty decent jump, as again we've talked about in this group, where we have a large number of projects that, while they've been approved by the town meeting maybe several years ago, for various reasons they haven't been built or the equipment acquired. That will change this year. And we expect to borrow a significant amount of money in August of 26 or September, August of 26, which would result in a jump in debt service payments in 27. And that's really on the expense side. So that shows we're still working with around a deficit of, with those expenses locked in, around $2.5 million based on our revenue forecast. And what I presented as a balanced budget scenario was, how do we get back to zero on that deficit? Well, just a little bit north of zero. Is if town and schools go up by 2.38%, then budget reductions would get that to a balanced budget scenario. Obviously, there are other factors or other potential ways to mitigate some of those reductions. We haven't talked about the use of free cash. I've recommended $700,000 rather than a different number from the operating budget stabilization fund. And then other kind of policy choices made within the schools and the town departments about what is included in the budgets and how those budgets are built. So that's the good news, for lack of a better description, unfortunately, just where the math lines up on the budget this year. So where we're at is we're working with our town department, so I identify the reductions to meet the balanced budget. I know the school department is doing likewise. We'll do a final revenue forecast ideally later this month with potentially some upward revisions. We'll see where state aid is. We'll again do a thorough review of those local receipts when we get some final numbers in terms of what's being billed for this year. And then we'll continue to work with the assessors on new growth, which we continue to track on an annual basis. This one, we get the personal property, the utility new growth in like February. If that number drops off, that could have an impact on our forecast. If that number has stayed strong, then maybe we can look at some additional growth there. And then it's a matter of how quickly the projects that are undergoing construction now make progress over the next several months. We have to talk about the use of free cash, which we've targeted towards, general stabilization fund to meet the financial policy, the capital budget as we do on an annual basis, additional contributions to the operating budget stabilization fund, or a first-time contribution to the sped stabilization fund. And then if there are any one-time costs within the departmental budgets, that might be appropriate uses of free cash. We have $4.5 million, as Jay alluded to earlier. We've used 60,000 of that in order to get the general stabilization fund to be about 5% of the budget. That we need anywhere between $600,000 and $750,000 of free cash for that use to meet that policy. But otherwise, that does leave it in a decent amount left to be expended. And then health insurance, this is the one place where I'd say in the budget, there's risk of increased expenses than forecast that would make that deficit larger rather than smaller, only because that number is based on some changes in the market in terms of what the providers are covering and based on 5 months of claims data so far this year. So every month we get a revision in terms of an update on how our claims are tracking. And if we have a better than expected claims year, maybe there's a downward revision, but more likely if things track worse than anticipated, that could mean an upward revision. So I just do want to caution on the health insurance number that it's early. We typically finalize that number in February. So that's the one that's susceptible to bad news. I think anything else in terms of revenue would be upward positive revisions. So that's where things stand at the moment. Happy to take any questions or to dive into greater detail or let the committee discuss. Thank you.
Nick, the thinking around the 3% being the expectation for town department budgets going up on an annual basis based on the override money. I have said this last week or right before the holidays. I would believe that no matter what the year, the school department would have a hard time coming in at 3%. And I'm not sure if that's a formula that will result in anything but reductions over the next 5 years in the public schools. And so my worry is the fiscal structure that we're trying to adhere to will always be revenue challenged, and we always need to look at expenses, which is where we are now. But just from a big picture perspective, I'm wondering what the discussion was like about that being 3% moving forward. And anybody here who's been here for that time, I'm the new guy.
I'm not following in terms of, is that a question to me?
Yeah, that's I guess, well, it is a question to you, but it can be a question to anybody else that was at the table during that time. That if we're backing into a number of $9.5 million for an override, when a group decided that 3% was going to be part of that expense side of the formula, did folks anticipate that would be something that might not be achievable by some town departments, especially the school department, based on the fact that school revenue or expenses have been averaging about over 5%, maybe 5.8 over the last 9 years, and that might be part of the problem. But going right to 3% and then having that be the expected number annually, I think folks, I'm not sure whether that was explicit to at least me coming in as a new superintendent, and from the first PTO meeting I had on Friday, not explicit to the public.
So
I
let
can-
me, go ahead.
Yeah, I can give my perspective on that. I was a member of the warrant committee last year. There was little to no public discussion or discussion among, I'll say, the warrant committee as to what was going into like a 5-year projection. I have a file that Ms. Dexter and Mr. Milano provided to the warrant committee last spring, which had a 5-year projection. There wasn't much discussion of it. And the assumptions in that file were 2.5% increase for school salaries and town salaries, 3% increase for school general expenses and town general expenses. So to the extent there was a 5-year plan, those were the assumptions built into that plan. But the warrant committee didn't have extensive discussions or really any discussions about that assumptions and what it meant for 5 years. And I didn't observe the select board having such discussions. So if you're saying more of the public discussions, I'd say there weren't, in my opinion. Which we can bemoan the past or work for the future.
Yeah, I don't care to bemoan the past, I just wanna figure out how we got here as the person responsible to cut 26 people in the next 3 weeks. And would have been better able to do that in a more thoughtful way had the deficit been identified earlier, so we could have been working on it and talking about it. And
You've
being
been-
very, very public about it.
We've been very publicly in this meeting talking through revenue forecast for the last 5 months in extremely focused detail.
The revenue, absolutely.
Yes. And that revenue number has not changed since we first started meeting as a group here and I first started communicating that around town. It's been a 3% roughly increase year over year on revenue with about $4.2 million. The one deviation that's happened since we started meeting as a group is my recommendation of infusing that with another $700,000 from the operating budget stabilization fund. So what we discussed with the select board last year was if we set aside $700,000 into an operating budget stabilization fund and town departments and school departments come in at or below 3% and health insurance comes in at or below 7%, then this will fund for the next several years, assuming we drive down from the operating budget stabilization fund. That was the discussion, the select board, after much back and forth, that $9.5 million was too high, agreed with a $9.5 million override. So that's the history there. The more short-term history is we've been discussing at this group and in other groups, and I've gone to other meetings of the school committee in particular and talked about the fiscal 27 revenue forecast of $4.2 million or a 3% increase. So I appreciate it's not enough from your perspective, but the information was shared, it was delivered in this group and in other groups. So if that message needs to be delivered differently or in a different, more obvious way, I don't really know how to do that, but I'm open to any suggestions to doing so. But that's just where I draw a line in terms of information not being known. We can talk about the numbers for the override, but we also have to go back into politics and talk about the political factors that were at play there. In terms of the near-term history, that information was shared and delivered. And I don't know what else to add to that other than we've consistently talked about a 3% budget increase for 27 within this group and in other groups.
I would just say that I don't recall, we've already had this conversation, the 3% part of this. And understand the fiscal challenges of the town moving forward and pledge to be a good fiscal partner with the town in order to kind of make sure the budget's right sized and reset to support the overall budget picture. But that communication, I feel like I was not very much, I wasn't aware to the degree that we're sitting here now at a 2.2 or 2.4 or $2 million cut. It didn't seem like that conversation was the body of the conversation. In the meeting we had on Wednesday, we used things like level service. That's certainly not level service. And in this meeting, we actually had members say, geez, we have so much revenue, we might be able to give some back. So that there has been, in this table, even a conversation that seems to be disconnected from the reality of what our expense expectations were. So I don't want to go backwards. I don't want to bemoan. I want to just be really clear that as the superintendent of schools that's responsible for 66% of this budget, had I known very clearly that we would be coming up against a roughly 1.8, 2.2, or settled at a $2 million deficit, I certainly wouldn't have been presenting a 5.2% increase in October. I would have been presenting whatever you asked me to present, which was a 3% budget, and hope that it was going to go up or down. But I would have given you what you asked for. I asked you in that meeting, my deliverable is rolling everybody over with percentages for the raises. And the answer to that question was yes. So that's what we did. And I only say that because it's going to be important for the public to understand how we got here and why we weren't talking about this earlier. So the conversations that we have in small groups, as effective as these groups can be, is one thing, but if had we known, I would have been able to inform our families sooner than later. And that we would have been in the same spot fiscally, but at least folks wouldn't have felt somewhat caught off guard. So I'm ready to work and I'm ready to move forward. I just had to say it out loud.
So I think there are two explanations that we need to agree on. One for those of us who are closer to the budget process and closer to an understanding of municipal finance, and then another explanation for the rest of the general public who asks why, if we just did a $9.5 million override, are we talking about or having to talk about making any cuts at all? So on the first point, for those of us who are closer to the budget process and closer to municipal finance, I think whether anyone said explicitly you're going to have to come in at a 2.8 or 3% growth rate, and this is not just the schools, this is all town departments. Whether someone said that explicitly in October or not, I don't know how anyone could come away from a conclusion that, or with a conclusion that the growth rate in the schools over the last 3 years has been about average 6.3%. And over, as you said, over the last 5 years, somewhere around 5.7 or 5.8%, and somewhere over 3% for the town budgets, when the revenue base is growing at 2.5%. So at some point, we were going to have to face that reality, and I think we have kicked the can down the road a number of times. But at some point, we were going to have to face the reality that that growth rate was unsustainable. So that's what I would say to this group. To the people who are asking the question, I think legitimately, how are we talking about cuts? Here's my take on that. So normally, we did a $9.5 million override. 8.8 million of that was allocated directly to the levy, and 700,000 also increased the levy limit, but was allocated to the stabilization fund. However, different from all other overrides that we've done, the other 3 overrides that we've done, we started with roughly a $6 million deficit that the schools had amassed over the last 2 fiscal years. And therefore, so you start with 9.5 million. If you have to cover those recurring expenses, most of them were recurring expenses. There were a few that weren't, but let's say for the sake of discussion that it was around 6 million. So you take the 9.5 million, now you have 3.5 million. And again, with a growth rate, level service growth rate, that's well above 2.5%, you're starting with a deficit. And we've got, because we self-insure, we've got roughly what we think is a $1 million cost in terms of health insurance increased premiums. So, unfortunately, although it looked like a large override, and in fact it was the 5th largest override in the 50-year history of Proposition 2.5, that's not really what we had available, and therefore, we're almost right back where we started, which is we've got a growth rate in the town and school budgets that's unsustainable, and each year we're going to have these discussions. And if your rejoinder is, well, we should have told people that, probably we should have, but here we are. So I guess my question for the school committee and the superintendent, John, is if you don't think 3% is reasonable, what's the number that you think is reasonable? I certainly agree that that's going to create some pain that probably is not warranted. So what's the right number? But we need to acknowledge that we have a structure where the rate of expenses or the growth of expenses exceeds the growth of the revenue each year.
I understand that concept, and I've been doing this work for a long time, with you for 18 of those years.
I've
And
enjoyed every minute.
absolutely. So we can fight like dogs and go home and drink from the same bowl, that's all right.
Right.
I agree, and my job is to sustain the district fiscally, come up with a budget that supports the students first and foremost, that's sustainable, and hand it off to a new superintendent. That was part of our budget philosophy, that's my expectation, I planned on doing that work, I'm not walking away from that work at all. We did this initially on our own by reducing about 9 positions in August in order to kind of get a head start on that work, so I understand the work. I just want to make sure that when we're doing this work, we all know that we have a hard-working group of 100 people or 200 people that pay attention all the time. But when a community steps up and votes a $9.5 million override, I just want to make sure that we're very explicit about what that means. And so that may be something that we need to take on as the carrier of that news, and then work out what the budget looks like. So we will do that. The rate of increase of steps and lanes for 81% of our budget is roughly 2.5%. Going anything below 4.5% means that you're just giving zeros for 3 years every year. So and we need to reduce staff in order to come in line with this. I think we need to reset our budget. So I'm fully prepared to work towards that end. The number, I think over time, is for a school department to maintain a certain level of staffing that delivers the service delivery that this town expects. I'm taking a ballpark guess, is probably around 4.5%, between 4 and 5%. And we know that in all smaller, non-commercial taxable towns, that number needs to be systematically, hopefully, if we can get our work together, replenished with overrides of smaller amounts over shorter durations in order to be a fiscal planning group as opposed to just, let's give a chunk of money. And I know that that's what this group is trying to solve, and I know our expenses are exceeding that right now, so we'll work on the work, but I understand the task. I just wish I understood the task sooner, individually, as an individual.
Come back on. Megan, you want to
Megan.
say something?
I have my hand raised. No, thanks everyone. I just wanted to add that I understand people don't want to relitigate the past, and sometimes in budgeting conversations, as in all conversations among human beings, something can be missed. And I think all we can do at this point is work really hard together and work the problem. Superintendent, I think, I'm glad you're stating your truth in this. And I think it's just really important for all of us as we step forward in this conversation and as we go out to the public to really make sure that we are working the problem and not leveraging the politics of the situation too much. And I know some of that is going to happen, But I just want to put this out there right now that that's not going to help us to solve the challenge that we're in, which is that we have to align some of these growth rates. And, I also just want to point out too, I don't know how closely everybody is following the health insurance situation statewide, but it is pretty bad. And we're not the only municipality in the Commonwealth, and not the only school system that's dealing with this situation. I mean, it truly, the way I see it is we had a couple of unforecasted risks that just we couldn't anticipate in the model. And on both sides, we need to do some pencil sharpening, right? Like this isn't this discuss. This was just the opening point in the conversation. I want to commend everybody here for starting this discussion. I think it's starting sooner than it has in the past. And I think we're walking away from last week's conversation really looking on both ends, on the school committee's end and on the town's end, for where we can find ways to finesse the situation so that we can get to that more responsible approach to the school budget. I am hopeful that we are going to get there if we work together on it.
In full disclosure, my daughter is a teacher at Cunningham. She was on the list last year to get cut, and she's on the list this year to get cut. I hold a unique position in that I see both sides of the scenario. I've been a taxpayer longer than I've been a mother of a teacher in town, so I kind of wear that hat a little bit more securely on my head. And I remember having this discussion with her last year, and I said, just because your job is safe this year, I don't expect it to be safe next year. So I had sort of seen the writing on the wall. Milton has never depended on commercial. It's gone down a little bit through the years. So I don't think that is ever going to change significantly. And I don't think a discussion on increasing our commercial tax base will ever move the needle of our taxes. And I could be wrong, but my understanding is to get about a $2 million infusion of cash into the levy, we need about $40 million worth of commercial space, and that's just not going to happen. So from a political point, I'm here as the planning board representative, I know that there's been a lot of chatter out there about increasing our commercial space. And I think that's going to be a very challenging thing to do, and I don't think it's actually going to solve our problem. Where we do actually get more property taxes from larger developments like 88 Wharf. I think there's 76 units at 88 Wharf, and that brings in, I don't know, $800,000. Just as a taxpayer, I've always questioned some of the policies on both sides. I'm not overly familiar with unions, but I always thought to myself, how can we be negotiating union contracts at greater than 2.5% every year when our tax levy only goes up 2.5%? So how can we be giving out increases at 3%, 3.5%, when that's just not sustainable. So those are just the different hats that I'm kind of wearing at the moment. And I think everybody's here in good faith. And I said this at the first meeting, I've got the most respect for John Phelan and for Katie, and we all want what is best for our students. And I personally don't like to be labeled as anti-school, which I have been labeled that way. But I think, unfortunately, cuts are going to have to happen. And I think it's just been delayed a little bit too long. And just on another revenue stream, which we haven't tapped into in a long time, and I don't think the needle's moved too much, is our pilot. Like, have we gone out enough to Milton Academy and Curry and Milton Hospital? And is there any way we can increase our pilot donations?
That is always a place to try to persist. I would just note that when you do research in terms of the place where Milton does not get revenue in terms of from other communities is the hospital. Small institutions like Curry College are not giving pilot payments in other communities that in a small college like that. So we are a significant outlier in terms of a small undergrad based kind of institution in terms of a contribution. They do make an annual contribution. And in terms of, the private schools, the biggest is Phillips in Andover, and they're about $450,000. We get about $250,000 from Milton Academy. In terms of other small institutions or colleges high schools like that, where we're doing okay. So if we were at the bottom of the barrel of a lot of people incurring lots of revenue, I would say there's possibility of significant growth there. But if you look around the state in terms of other institutions and their communities, we're generally an outlier on those two. An outlier the wrong way on the hospital, but on the Curry College front and the Milton Academy front, I think we do better than most communities do.
Before, I like to say that when we meet together in one of the reasons that we are all here is the override and the conversation about what we're all missing in this room right now. Whether the schools knew it should be 3%, whether the conversations we're walking away, everyone actually understands what each group is responsible for. I think when the warrant committee suggested that we had a joint group, which we have here, a lot of it was because of these miscommunications, right? The schools understand that for the projections we had during the override and after, that they needed to be around 3.5% for the numbers to work. Did we know that what it meant to be at 7% in insurance, which is what we talked about, I think, for most of last year. So with that said, I think we all have this understanding of where we may have spoken past each other or what we may have missed. And to the school's perspective, this is late. I can say over the last couple of years, it feels that we're having a conversation that we did not get to have over the last 2 or 3 years. And would really like us to start getting to the point of what do we do for this year? What do the schools need? What is in that 3.8 number? What are the mitigations or the solutions we have if there are going to be cuts? I think that's really what we're tasked with getting done here, and moving past some of what we may have missed or miscommunicated or, gotten wrong for the last few years. And if we are a bit late for the schools, then I really want us to get to the point of what are we gonna do now? Right? What are the solutions? What are the issues? We've communicated with our parents about 26 cuts. What do those cuts mean? Who is on? What are the chances we have to keep some of these people? And if we do keep them this year, what does the growth look for next year? I think we're talking about this year and the next 2, and we really got to get to that. The points of the politics, the points of what we may have gotten wrong, I think we've done that enough in this group, and I really want us to start pushing for it.
Can I jump in? Can you all hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
we can hear you.
Sorry, I've had my hand up. I agree to a certain extent, Winston. I just think, honestly, this is more than a 1 year issue. And I think, the school committee and the select board and the warrant committee, obviously through the FY27 budget cycle, we will have to work through the current year budget. I think what I see from the school side is kind of what John talked about previously, which is the long term and being clear on what financial stability we are offering to the town and to our departments. And the way we currently have this set up is going to result in kind of annual cuts of 15 to 20 staff a year. Again, maybe a little bit less if health insurance comes in, but this is not a health insurance issue. This is a how are we creating kind of a sustainable budget issue over time. If you look at the school department percent increase in budget going back to 2010 within this town, the average annual increase is 4.74%. The median increase is 4.72%. There's been 2 years that it was below 3.33%. And both those were significant cut years back in like 2011, 2012. I don't know what number other than just like revenue, but like I think the concern the schools have around not having heard that 3% number before is that 3% number is not based in any historical context of what the schools have received or have asked for or have needed, even again, to John's point, to maintain level service. So to me, it feels like if we as a town are creating a financial system where every year we're requiring our schools to cut 15, let's call it, staff until we get to the next override, that is a broken system, in my opinion, and we aren't doing our job to create kind of stability within those expectations. And so that is the problem I see as most pressing is, how is it that over those last, since FY 2010, we were able to kind of sustain these higher increases. We don't see that moving forward. So what do we need to change about how we are budgeting, how we are projecting, how we are, to push back a bit on the revenue side, like how are we creating some additional revenue within the town, whether it's zoning or something else that's obviously more long-term versus kind of the next 1 to 2 years. But what are the ways in which we fix what, in my opinion, looks to be kind of a very significant long-term problem where we're just going to be cutting these departments, not just schools, but also police, fire, DPW, council on aging. We're going to be cutting them down to the bone until the point in time where we feel it's politically viable to go back for another override. And then we're just going to have to deal with that all again over the next 5 years after the next override. And so something about the way we're doing this feels broken if this is the only solution.
And Mark, I take your point, like this, we are constrained a lot by Prop 2.5 and the general system that we're in. I will push back on the ideas around revenue because I can make the argument that the town has generated more revenue, right? We can look at the numbers in the last 2 or 3 years, whether by or purposefully or accidentally. We've got more in interest income, we've got more in collections, which has been a concerted effort, right? 40Bs, although we don't have much control over that, has contributed to the budget. And a lot of those buildings are folks who are buying into our town that do not live here yet, right? Those are permits that have gone. So we do have more revenue. I think we cannot escape the fact that our expenses are rising extremely quickly. And perhaps some of that is that it is hard on the schools right now, being the largest part of our budget. And that's why we're trying to have this conversation about what does this look like as these expenses are rising so quickly that we have to make adjustments in certain pieces, right? We have not had health insurance in the teens before. We are projecting at 7, which was on the higher end. Now we're at 10, hopefully, hoping that we get to 10. I think we all can read the articles about where our insurance expenses are going. So it is hard, it is unique. We do want to have that 1 year, 3 year, and 5 year plan. but we are really, really handcuffed right now by our economic situation. So that it's not that we want to put all of this on the back of the schools and say you have to come in at 3%. But we have to look at, I think, the space that we're living in right now, that it is just incredibly hard in these 2 to 3 years. And so we're asking, what does that look like for the schools, right? Tell us, give us the pieces. What do these 26 cuts look like, so that we can talk about how do we perhaps mitigate it for this year and the coming years. And I think that's what I'm really pushing for with this group. We got to start moving towards now what?
Yeah, I guess, Winston, if let's say in a scenario where health insurance came in at 3%, that wouldn't solve the problem, right? It would reduce the impact. We wouldn't have a $2 million cut, and 26 positions, but we'd still have $1 million cut, right? And 13 positions, and again, Nick would know the numbers better, but I don't think it is health insurance exacerbates the issue a bit. It is not a health insurance issue. It's a broader issue. And obviously Prop 2.5 has been around for a long time. And the town has, as I said, 4.72% is the median increase. And there's really been very few increases below kind of the 3.5%. So, and historically, that's just what the town has done and has been able to do. So it to me is that there's got to be a better way. Prop 2.5 is the reality. It's always been the reality. It will continue to be the reality. So we have to think creatively and process wise, figure out how we are going to, create operating override, whatever, operating stabilization funds and utilizing that differently, whatever it might be. And that's why I look to the town administrator, look to this group with their, the great expertise within the room to say, we know what we will need in order to run these departments. We know historically what town department percent increases are. We know what the school historical increases are. Let's take that information. Let's figure out how could we create systems that fund that kind of long term. Again, next year seems like an issue we will obviously need to deal with, and we are dealing with, but I'm really concerned that we're just going to cut 26 people. And then our very next step is going to be, okay, who are the next 15 we need to cut the following year? And who are the next 15 we need to cut for FY29? Because that's what it feels like is the future in front of us if we're not thinking more creatively on how we solve this long term.
So Mark, just let me give you just a little more history, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but 2011 to 2017, I was actually in your seat, and there were years during that period where we actually had deficits. It was never the case that we went to the select board and said, we need help, we can't manage this deficit. The way that we managed the deficit was to go through a painstaking process with principals of saying, tell us how you could make a 2%, 3% cut if you needed to. And some years we actually needed to take those recommendations and we did reduce positions. And some years we didn't. But the point is that good budget discipline is to every year look at, do we need all the positions that we needed last year? Or do we need different positions? And if we need different positions, how within the context of our budget do we fund them? And I think we're gonna need some, and the good news is that one of the key partners in that process was John Phelan. So you have the expertise, you have the experience you need on that side, but at some point, you're going to have to go through the normal, regular budget exercise of saying, what do we absolutely have to have to preserve or to meet the objectives that we've set? Primarily, how do we make sure that the outcomes in the classroom are exactly what we want them to be and what people expect them to be? And what are the like to haves? And in some cases, the like to haves have to fall off. There's gotta be some process every year where the school committee does that, and frankly, the less public it is, the better. But it has to happen in order, as you say, to get us on a path where we don't have to make these kinds of painful cuts every year. But some annual look at the budget and some annual adjustments of the budget have to happen. And the school committee has to drive that.
Yeah, I completely understand that, and obviously we are doing that within the year. My concern is if what the town administrator is saying is we should at best expect a 3% increase every year. Out of the last 16 years, the school departments have had less than a 3% increase 3 times. And so if that is the new reality where every year we need to be expecting a 3% budget, then we are doing that process every year, which again, if that is what we need to do in order to meet a balanced budget, that is what the school committee and the school department will do because that is our job and we know how to do that. I'm saying that to me feels like a broken system and that we as the fiscal stewards of the town aren't doing our job right if that is the condition we are forcing upon principals and teachers and families, and not counting residents as a whole with all the other town departments. But if we are telling a principal every year, find me an additional 4 people from your school to cut, that is creating a lot of instability in program and experience for our kids that again, in certain years, you can anticipate that and like understand that needs to happen. But what I'm hearing from the town administrator is this isn't a 1-year blip caused by health insurance premiums increasing so much. This is a long-term expectation of just how things are going to operate moving forward. And again, that's where I think this group should be spending, like, are there other options other than that, right? Is there something we can do and establish within this town, as we, I think, tried to do with the operating stabilization fund, to say, actually, like, how do we create systems where we're not just needing to cut every single year? Because this is not about like a single year budget. It's about how you're perpetuating percent increases over time. But again, I've taken up a lot of airtime here, so I apologize, and I'll just go on mute.
I apologize. I have a 9:00 meeting that I did let Nick know that I would have to leave a little early. Over the next few weeks, we'll be producing a budget that matches the $2 million deficit and bringing that to the finance committee and to the public probably by the end of January. And we'll get on it and we'll work towards that. And we'll be communicating with everybody about what that looks like. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Superintendent. I also just want to point out we are 5 minutes away from 9 a.m. And we should try to be ending the meeting on time.
2 minutes away from 9 a.m.
Oh, I see 8:56 on my computer. Maybe it's off.
I think it is.
Okay.
I'll just say a couple things because I just want to be quick. I'm basically an accountant, but projections. We talked once in this room about getting budget projections, which I think would be helpful for the town. And I don't know if we're any further on that, but I'm happy to jump in and help if need be. That's one point. And 2, school district, the details on it. Do we have details on the deficit that they're running now? Like, I don't, like, by account, the account details, the spreadsheets.
So our next meeting is going to be devoted to town and schools budget to actual by line items. So
You guys must have done some projection, right?
And can I clarify too? There is no current deficit. I think last year there was a difference because we had a current year deficit and we were projecting that 9.4% increase. We do not have a deficit this year. I just want to make sure that I don't want us to go back to the feeling that we had last year because we had the 2 issues at the same time.
So it's just the difference between
The
the
difference.
schools asking for their budget rolling over into next year.
Yes. So the difference is what makes up the difference between a level service increase and And I think a little bit of the difference too that I'm hearing, there's a lot of talk about a 3%. We're not talking about a 3%. We're talking about a 2.3% increase. So for us, that's about $600,000. So
And that's all for this year though, like the 26 people that he was gonna,
it's for the FY27 budget.
okay,
We are
That's
fine
important to know.
this year.
okay, thank you.
There is no
That
deficit
clarification,
this year.
that's- I wasn't clear on that, but I would like to see the details anyways. If we could see that, that would be helpful.
So the details for fiscal year 26, I'm working on the Q2 report.
Mhm.
We're gonna be discussing that at Finance Subcommittee on January 21st, and then School Committee, I believe, the same day.
Right.
And then we'll provide those reports to this committee and we can discuss, you can see the detail of
Thanks.
budget to actuals for this
In
year
terms
as well.
of fiscal 27, typically schools had presented like a budget book for warrant committee members. Is that,
Mhm.
that might be what Brian
Yeah.
was referring to as well. So do you have that for 27?
So we haven't presented that, we just did a high level service breakdown for 27. But that's just a part of the process. I think right now we're just focusing on making sure that we have, and I don't want to speak for John or for the school committee, but the focus for us internally is really just working on talking about what we're gonna cut for the $2 million.
Something I believe you already have, but I haven't seen it, is what's driving the 5.2% increase. I don't know if that's what Brian is
That's what I'm
asking.
trying to get to.
Yeah, what's driving the 5.2% increase? And I think you've made that presentation, I just haven't seen it.
So all of the materials that we present to Finance Subcommittee and School Committee are on the school department's website on the budget page.
Thank you,
And we share them out so you can see in
Okay.
the meeting materials too.
thank you.
I think the October and November school committee sub-finance kind of goes through that detail of the budget rolling
Yeah.
over as well.
All right, I'll look at that then, thank you. And one other point is, I know this has come up before, but we're overfunded on the pension. This is a Band-Aid, so it's not like a long-term fix, but if you're overfunded on pensions, I don't think you have to pay. And I know they always ask money, they always want you to pay, but you probably don't have, actually, you don't have to if you're overfunded.
In
It's good.
the retirement board sets the funding schedule, and then by law, the town has to meet it. So the retirement board has set a funding schedule that now
Can you push
we, the
back?
town of Milton, it's been set for the next 2 years. So
Even if you're overfunded.
I didn't mean to
I
interrupt.
dealt with this with another
I just
company.
meant, I was responding more on a purely procedural commentary. In terms of the bigger picture, I'll defer to either the chair of the retirement board or the chair of the warrant committee.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I could talk your ear off about the Milton pension
Oh.
status. No,
No,
outside
I
the
just-
meeting,
Yeah, I have familiarity with pensions, and I know that we never, if we were overfunded, we didn't have to pay.
I'm
I always,
happy to.
they always wanted the money, but you didn't really have to pay it. So it's a question you can always, just something to look at.
Give me 2 rounds.
Can I make a hopefully quick comment?
Yeah, sure.
If the answer is no, the answer is no.
Sure.
Going back at least 30 minutes to what Mr. Milano said about, he shared where the revenue is coming in. And what more could you share? I think I struggled to make the leap of revenues coming in at this amount. And therefore that means this for overall town spending, therefore that means this for specific spending. I struggled with that. So maybe that's something we all can work on.
No, and that's helpful, and I appreciate that comment in terms of trying to distill in terms of, okay, the amount of money is X, what does that mean for everybody? I think that's a helpful comment.
Thank you.
Katie, are you planning to do the budget books for the warrant committee?
Yes.
Madam Chair, anything?
No, I'll take a motion to adjourn if we've got one.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, thanks, everyone.